climate change and due to all different
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, sorry, that surprised me. So anyway, some housekeeping notes before we start. Please can you all keep your microphones off for the duration unless you're speaking, obviously. And this event is going to be recorded and posted on YouTube, which is probably more stressful for me than it is for you. And please can you ask questions via the chat box, because we're going to be doing a Q&A, about half an hour worth of Q&A after we've all had a bit of a chance to talk. So if you do send a question, and we really encourage you do so, can you please put your name and which organisation you are from before your question, so we know where you're asking from. And if you'd like to tweet about this, which please do, can you use the hashtag land4food, which is land4food, all one word after a hashtag. So as you can imagine, as an environment reporter, I have been very busy recently, what with the recent heat wave and the Tory leadership election, which has been, luckily there has been some focus on climate, a little bit of a focus on farming in the end, which has been good. But it's been very busy, and it's a perfect time to launch this report, because we are all talking about food security at the moment, and we're talking about how we can best use our land and be more resilient during climate change. We've seen, even though a lot of us take our food for granted, I mean, the farmers who are about to speak probably don't, but those of us who just go to the supermarket, we think it's always going to be there. We think that it's always going to be at the same price. But recently we've seen that world events like what's happened in Ukraine, and even what happened with that ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. One event can change everything, because our food is so interconnected in the world. And it's actually, even though it seems quite secure, it's not. And this is going to get even more pronounced during climate change, because a lot of the countries that currently produce food are under threat, and of drought, of flooding. And we are going to see ourselves having to change where and how we produce our food. And that's even true in our relatively mild climate in the UK. So the report has shown some quite shocking statistics about how we've built on quite a lot of our most prime agricultural land. I think it's increased 100-fold since 2010, the amount of infrastructure built on some of our best agricultural land in this country. And not only that, but 60% of our best agricultural land is also under threat from flooding. So we're going to, at some point, have to completely kind of take another look at how we use our land and how we draw up where we build things and where we farm. And we might even have to move people around and move things around. And we're going to have to really look at it, because this is becoming even more crucial, and we don't want to leave it too late, because obviously food is one of the most important things that we can produce. So today we're going to be talking about how can we balance decarbonising society with increasing biodiversity, increasing food security, and doing things like solving the housing crisis. And these are all very difficult things to balance, and it's a huge task. I actually was thinking about this when I was writing about the food strategy, which came out the other week, which I'm afraid to say, I'm sorry for the former minister in the panel, it was quite disappointing for many of us, because it didn't really show, I mean, it showed a bit of movement, but it didn't have any really good policies about how we can sustainably feed people in this country. It had a lot of aspirations, but not a lot of policy. But we need policies, and we need them now. So we're about to speak to some experts on these matters, and hear about what their ideas are, and what they think the pressures that we're facing on our food systems are, and how we can fix them. So first up, we have Tom Fyans, who is the Deputy CEO of the CPRE, and he's been working quite closely on this report, I think. So he's going to have some good insights into what it actually says. And also, if you want to have an overview, I actually wrote pieces in The Guardian today, so do get a paper after this. And yeah, he's very well placed to tell us about the report, so I'm going to hand over to him.
Thanks, Helena, and good morning, everybody. Nice to see so many people joining us. Helena, you beat me to the punchline now. I was going to say, if you haven't read the report, do read Helena's article, and it'll save you probably about an hour of your life. But it's a great piece, and thank you for that. And thank you also to the rest of the panel on behalf of CPRE. We're really looking forward to a good debate. And particularly to Rebecca, who has joined us very last minute. So particular thanks to her. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on a few areas in the report. So building on our food security is actually the latest in a long line of CPRE reports on development that really asks just a very simple question. Is this the best use of land for this development? And as a case study on the urgent and competing demands on our land we're seeing at the moment, it's like a beginner's guide on how exactly not to do it, showing an exponential rise in the development on really important farmland, whilst brownfield land just sits idly by, all against the backdrop of actually the biggest threat to our food security, which is the climate emergency. And I don't think any of us need any reminder that it is crunch time on the climate this week for so many reasons. Look, the next Prime Minister's inbox is going to be full of crises interlinked. We've got cost of living, the climate, food security, housing, energy. Policies we put in place now are going to really make the difference of whether this country is a successful or failure. And what we hope with this report is that it really helps to start to influence the debates about where development should go, where it shouldn't go, all in the context of food security and the climate emergency, two of those huge crises that we face. So first, the bad news, just briefly. Helena's touched on a bit of it, but CPRE are always good at the bad news as well as the good news. So since 2010, the report's saying we've lost 14,000 hectares of our most important agricultural land to development. The majority of that has gone to housing, and most of that housing is not affordable to most people in this country. So there's a land use issue there on whether that's been the best decision in the first place, never mind whether it was on agricultural land or not. Once productive farmland is lost, obviously it's lost for good if it's housing, yet the destruction of this irreplaceable resource is really increasing. There's been a 100-fold increase, as Helena mentioned earlier, since 2010. That means in practical terms, 2 million people can be fed their five a day from vegetables homegrown in England, less than they could have been if it had been maximised for its proper use. And I think it's high time we started valuing the ability to feed ourselves in this country. And I'm sure Minette will talk about that. Because in future, we may not be able to rely on the food imports that we're relying on at the moment. We simply can't keep building on our productive farmland. It makes no sense and it must stop soon. Climate change poses an even greater risk to food security, as I mentioned earlier. 60% of our best growth farmland, as Helena said, is located within areas of the highest risk of severe flooding. And in low-lying areas of East England, some of you are from that area today, thank you for coming, 95% of our best farmland is in flood zone 3. So that knowledge that no matter what we do now, our food security will be threatened by flooding in the future is why we must urgently protect all BMV land from development. And the truly scandalous part, and Rebecca obviously now isn't a minister, so maybe I'll have to speak a bit more freely on this. This research is the first ever to quantify the scale of development nationally on the two highest and most important productive grades of farmland. It's never been done before on our most important farmland. The government didn't know, hadn't done the research, doesn't have the figures. But the good news is that CPRE does know, has done the research and does have the figures, as we always do on land use. And it's not too late to act now, if we act now. We need to move away from intensive farming, move towards a more multifunctional approach that uses the most efficient use of our land, because there's lots of things we require from it at the moment. We already know that changes to planning policy, just to give one example, could see 1.3 million homes built on brownfield land, saving the countryside for farming, recreation and nature recovery. Not only do we have plenty of space for affordable housing, this research also touches on, and we're not going to talk about it much today in my presentation, but it looks at food and energy security too, and the type of issues we've got to grapple with there around renewable energy and where it should go. So just to finish up, CPRE are building and piecing together the evidence on optimal land use, whether it's greenbelt in the countryside next door, AOMBs, brownfield or BMV land. But we really need to look at an even higher strategic level at how we address the glaring problem of what should go where. We need to integrate our strategic planning on transport, housing, energy, and of course, agriculture, whilst also addressing the climate and nature emergencies. It's not easy, but at the moment we have no blueprint to do that. We just keep making random decisions. So just to finish up, Natural England's recent commitment to a land use framework is good news, but we need to see policies in all these areas that would drive immediate improvements. We can't wait years to discuss what a perfect framework strategy looks like. We need action now. So we're asking as CPRE for the government to produce a land use strategy, really look at the planning system, look at farming, and drive the kind of decision making that would see the kind of loss we've seen today in this report of our most important farming land a thing of the past. So I'll leave it there, Helena. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Now we have Sue Pritchard, who's the CEO of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. And as well as that, she doesn't just talk the talk, she walks the walk. She lives on an organic farm in Wales, so she also knows what's happening on the ground as well. So kick it off, Sue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's lovely to be here. I ought to warn you that I'm actually speaking to you from the Royal Welsh Show today. And whilst I've shut all of the windows, I'm sweltering inside, you may get the odd cheer from outside. It's not for us, it's going to be for the Welsh Cobs. But I'm really, really delighted to be here. I really did want to join this panel today because this is such an important contribution to the much needed work on questions of land use, how we use our land and how we square off all of the different requirements that we have on land, particularly when we're starting to also think about how we tackle the climate and nature crisis, which is going to be very much uppermost in all of our minds right now. At the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, we've been working on the development of a land use framework since about 2018, and we made this very recommendation in our 2019 report, Our Future in the Land. But we are now very much not alone in making this call, as well as the excellent work that CPRE has done published today. Many other eminent bodies are also now calling for a better process to mediate complex decisions around land. There's the Foresight Land Use Report back in 2010. The House of Lords Select Committee is working on this right now. The Committee on Climate Change and the National Food Strategy are all calling for a framework, along with Royal Society, Royal Town Planning Institute, Shared Assets, WWF, RSPB. I could go on, as well as the government's, actually the Geospatial Commission. So the government's own experts are recognising that now is the time to balance up and to look hard at how we make better quality decisions about land use. And just to quickly summarise, what are all the kinds of targets and issues that we are having to balance here? So the government's own targets list, and which have an implication for how we use land: net zero by 2050, 300,000 homes a year, 30,000 trees a year, big strategic road and rail developments like HS2, new much needed flood and coastal defences so that we can adapt to the impacts of the climate crisis, things like regional powerhouse cities, green growth clusters, free ports, and then other targets like halving the effects of air pollution, exceeding biodiversity and water quality objectives, restoring 75% of protected wildlife sites, having 70% of farms in the Sustainable Farming Initiative, and then, of course, designating new national parks, AONBs, recreational routes. But even as I rattle through that extensive list of targets and aspirations in the government's portfolio, there are, of course, also big gaps, one of which is illuminated by today's report. So how much food should the UK aim to produce to improve our food security and indeed take more responsibility for growing more of the healthy food we need and we are suited to grow here in the UK? And how can we improve public access to nature so that everyone can get demonstrable benefits? So we've not been asking these questions in a vacuum. Since 2020, FFCC has been piloting different approaches to a land use framework with a national group, but also in two places, in Devon and in Cambridgeshire. So when we contribute to government's thinking on this, we're able to do so with the benefit of contributions from citizens, from businesses, from farmers, from local government, other anchor institutions in places who ultimately are going to have to make this work on the ground. So whilst we absolutely agree that government needs to set the overarching principles for a land use framework, ultimately this is only going to work if it has real commitment from stakeholders on the ground. And we hear from citizens, from the work that we're doing in those pilot sites, that appetite for a land use framework is strong. People in most sectors can see that the time is absolutely overdue for doing this work, and indeed are very frustrated at having witnessed poor land use decisions. It reveals how important it is to get good sources of data and evidence, so that the data that CPRE has researched and brought to the fore today was completely absent, as Tom was saying just earlier on. And then that skews the quality of decision making, because we're not understanding all of the evidence in relation to each other, so that the decisions we end up making lead to unintended consequences in other really critical sectors. But a land use framework also brings people together to have some of those difficult conversations about the kind of choices and trade-offs we're going to have to make across public policy about how we use our land, what we prioritise, and whose voices count in that, in those decisions. And it's really, really important, I think, for me to say that local communities are really excited about the potential for land use frameworks to help them input to a broader range of land use decisions at an earlier stage than the current systems allow them to do so. They have really good local knowledge and lived experience, which could be better harnessed to avoid poor decisions and unexpected consequences. And just by way of, so our work on a land use framework is available on our website, and I can drop that in the chat earlier. You can see some of the detail of that we are continuing to develop with stakeholders. But I just want to finish my remarks with, I think, a cross-cutting issue that I'm afraid this government is going to have to face into. Both food systems and indeed housing systems are brilliant case study demonstrations of market failure. We have relied on increasingly unregulated free markets to provide those elements of our economy, those foundational elements of our economy: good food, affordable and good housing. And self-evidently, they're failing to do so. Lots of the planners that we spoke to in developing our land use framework were hugely frustrated at their inability to work more effectively with house builders, so that the kinds of housing that's needed, sustainable, affordable housing in the right place, is prioritised, and that house builders are not just going after the easy land that they can build on in the most efficient way for them, but which just parcels off problems to other people and other sectors. And I think Minette might like this final stat I'm going to use. When I talk about market failures, they are really, really significant. The Help to Buy scheme, one of the government's flagship schemes that was designed to bring more young people to get more access to affordable housing, cost the government around £3 billion a year, which is about equivalent to the investment that government makes in farm support. But government's own evaluation has found that not only did that investment have no impact at all on people's access to affordable housing, but instead house builders trousered enormous sums of public money, one very notable one being the chief executive of Persimmons, whose bonus in 1 year alone was over £170 million. So when we talk about land use decisions, this is a time where government, business, and civic society really have to take up a bit more responsibility for making balanced decisions on our finite resource, our precious and finite resource land, which recognises all of those competing but critically important priorities. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, let's all keep it to 5 minutes. I'm keen to get to the Q&A so we can grill Rebecca before she has to go to PMQs. Next up, we have Minette Batters. It doesn't really need an introduction. I'm sure you will know who she is, but she is the president of the NFU, National Farmers Union, and she's been fighting tooth and nail for ages to get this food security on the agenda. And it finally is. So let's go, Minette. Thank you.
Helena, thanks so much, and delighted to be with you today. And this is a massively important report, and well done to CPRE for bringing it together, because it is timely. I would just want to set, I guess, the scene from how we see it at the NFU, and then I want to say effectively what we feel needs to happen. So I, as Helena says, have been banging on about food security seemingly for my entire time at the NFU, and now leaving the European Union, taking back control, whatever that might look like, a global pandemic where many of us couldn't buy what we wanted to buy when we wanted to buy it. And we've lived, all of us, extraordinary lives in living at home rather than out of home. So we've changed, in many cases, our shopping habits, and there is a lot of good, I think, to come out of that, and buying local and other things. And now the war in Ukraine, which I have to say makes the previous 4 years look incomparable and look quite easy. And I certainly never thought that I would be saying that. And so the war in Ukraine, I think, is a game changer. It's a game changer, not just for this country, but globally, it's a game changer. We are the lucky ones on this journey, and that we have a temperate climate and we can do something about it. And many parts of the world can't. They are very, very reliant on Russia and Ukraine. And my latest intelligence from Ukraine, speaking to the Agrarian Forum out there, is they think that plantings for next year could be down up to 40%. Now, that is massive when you take Russia out of the equation as well. So there is now, if you like, a moral imperative for us to step up and play our part effectively in what we're good at and what we don't need to draw off the world market. But there is another emerging problem, and there are now the two things. There are global warming and global feeding that need to be dealt with as one in the same thing. And something that often goes, I think, uncharted and certainly unremedied is water security. So we've got Italy declaring a state of emergency on water security. We've got Portugal in 95% drought. We are putting so much pressure on Spain to keep producing our fresh produce that it is totally unsustainable. And that tipping point is effectively reached now. And then I look at the situation here in the UK, where our requirements for water are only escalating upwards. And currently we are watering crops that we wouldn't normally be watering, like sugar beet. So those challenges are great. And then the final point I'd make on the challenges is that effectively in peacetime, government has legislated on targets for green energy, targets for trees, targets for species reintroduction, for taking land out of production, net zero, clean water, clean air, and absolutely right in many cases to be doing that. But what we haven't legislated on, and what we have left out of this current equation, is food production. And there's a real danger at the moment when we are working with a planning system that has been around for 75 years, pre-EU, during EU, and post-EU. The can kicking is ending right now. It really is. So things are really speeding up. And we are asking for a statutory underpinning of current levels of food production, predominantly stable around 60% for the last 2 decades. And in doing that, to be producing more effectively of what we're good at and having the right policies in place to do that. Fruit and vegetables obviously being first on that list. But also, and probably the one bit of pushback I'd have here, is we have to be producing to a certain extent what the market is demanding, because what consumers want, consumers will get from somewhere in the world. And when I look at what we've done in this country, we've gone to predominantly free-range egg production. Our poultry sector, both eggs and meat, has been a massive success story. It doesn't mean to say that there can't be new levels of investment to get to the right buildings in the right place, to deliver higher animal welfare standards, to maintain the welfare standards that we've got. But we mustn't forget that we've already got that in place. If I look at the pig sector, we are the largest producers of outdoor pork in the world. So when we talk about intensive sectors, we need to be really careful that we don't just pull out the drawbridge, because we will simply import it from other parts of the world produced to lower standards. So I make that point. And finally, so solutions. We've got to develop a new economic model, as I see it, for our countryside. I am part of the environmental farmers group here in South Wiltshire, whereby we've got 7 clusters, farmer clusters, whereby we're measuring what we've got. We've brought back the lapwing into my cluster here on the Avon Valley, but 7 clusters working on a whole catchment basis. We've set up a cooperative. We're now starting to work on new trades on water quality Phosphates and nitrates are good things in the right place, but they need to come away from the watercourses. Biodiversity, 2023, it's going to be legally binding. We've got to be able to stack what we do, whether it's water quality, biodiversity, or carbon trading eventually, but people get too excited about that. So I would like to see 65% of the budget in the SFI. I would like to see a bare minimum of 70% of farmers based on that platform, and then the ability to create these new trades that will deal with the challenges of phosphates, nitrates, biodiversity. Biodiversity needs investment, and we cannot just let housing developers, as they are at the moment, buy up land in order to think that they can drive land prices and land abandonment will deliver on biodiversity. It simply will not. So we need a new economic model that most importantly drives green finance, ESG funding back into the soil, because otherwise nothing will change. Final word, Helena, we need a symbiotic relationship. You know, we need buildings that are sympathetic with the landscape. We need affordable housing. You know, the rural economy has so much to offer. It could be so exciting, but we need to excite politicians that the rural side of things is just as exciting as the services sector in our cities. So that would be my final word. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minette. And now we have Rebecca Powell, who until very recently, she was a minister at DEFRA who worked a lot on biodiversity and agriculture and food. And she unfortunately quit last week, the week before, I can't even remember now, it's been so crazy, due to Boris Johnson's shenanigans. But she's so she's here to tell us all about what she thinks should be done and her work in DEFRA.
Thank you so much, Helena, and a good article that you put out today. And yeah, I'm going to put it out there straight away that, you know, I was absolutely gutted to have to come to that conclusion, to be forced to resign. And it was nothing to do with the good work I genuinely felt we were doing in the department and the huge strides we were making. So I'm still absolutely committed to the agenda on which I was working. And I just want to say it's very interesting, this topic. I've read the report and I really welcome it. Interestingly, when I went to university, which is a very, very long time ago, my dissertation was actually comparing the land use capability map and the soil survey of England and Wales, looking at grade 1 and 2 agricultural land and proving that too much of it was taken for development. So this is years ago, you know, and it is a pretty telling that we're still talking about these things. And I do actually think your report is critical, and I do think that a strategic approach is absolutely necessary to get this balance right that all the other speakers have been talking about, and these hugely growing demands on what is basically a finite resource. You know, it's a small island, isn't it? And everybody wants a piece of it. And I must say that this became more and more apparent to me in my role in DEFRA, with all the different areas I had under my hat and working also closely with the other ministers. And so I do actually really welcome the fact that DEFRA and other government departments had committed to next year starting to develop a new land use framework. And you could say, you know, not a moment too soon, because I do agree that it is pretty stark that we don't seem to have exactly the data that we do need, but it's really heartening as well that the Geospatial Commission is getting behind this. And in my work, I became all too aware even, you know, and I don't think there's any harm in saying this, about friction between departments. So I had to work, for example, with the Bays Department on the renewable energy targets. And they, you know, targets to deliver that. We all understand that net zero is a massive commitment. But of course, I was the Nature Recovery Minister, amongst other things. So, you know, my role would be to make sure that that wouldn't be sacrificing all the other things we're trying to do with land. So that was really telling. And so similarly then working with DULUC on their housing targets, also trying to solve the nitrates issue, whilst also protecting our land and ensuring that the land is actually there to have to develop sustainable ecosystems for all the demands we want, which includes, of course, food production. So it was really stark, and that's why I genuinely do think an overarching strategy is really, really critical. Also, in fact, this was really apparent in the ocean space as well. I know we're talking about land and development here, but actually it's really critical in our seas where everybody also wants a piece of the action. If you look at a map of our oceans, the demands on that are ever escalating. So we'd actually agreed with the all the offshore wind teams we're working with, and Bayes, industry, the Crown Estates and so forth, that we would start a mapping exercise of the sea as well. And there is a food impact there, of course, because there's also a requirement, you know, a fishing need, as well as the carbon sequestration need and all the other things our oceans need to provide for us. So I throw that in because this isn't just about land, really, because development is marching everywhere. Critically, we've also got to deliver all the measures that we introduced through the Environment Act that I was so proud to bring through Parliament, which took 2 years. And in our 25-year Environment Plan, which is now rolled into the Environment Act, that does state that that sustainable use of our natural resources is vital to improving the environment. And the Act, as you will know, has introduced measures, a couple of which I'll just mention. So all local authority areas will have to produce local nature recovery strategies. Well, of course, a land use map or land use planning would be incredibly helpful to that, to help each area decide where is the best place for what, to put what. And similarly, biodiversity net gain. Every development now, every new development will have to put back 10% more nature than was there when they started. So, you know, they need to know where that's got to go. Where is the best place for that? How could it work with farming and agriculture to help farming deliver their sustainable ecosystems and clean up the water, produce more healthy soil and so forth. So I do see a plan as critical. And not least as well, and it was touched on, I think, by Helena at the beginning, of course, climate change is with us, and we are getting further pressures and changes on our land. So we also need to take that into account in where we're allocating what. But I do say, I would always say to Minette, in terms of the nature that DEFRA is very responsible for restoring, I genuinely believe it's possible to have sustainable food production, maintain our food production levels, and even have more food production, but also have healthy and sustainable ecosystems funded and fueled by those payment systems. The SFI, you know, in soils, one of the first ones out of the blocks, isn't it? Which is critical, and I think that will tick lots of our boxes. But of course, it's not just those things that we've got to deliver. We've got to deliver the net zero policies, which have been touched on already. You know, the tree planting targets, the peat restoration targets, the renewable energy targets, and lots of people are coming to me now about solar in particular, some of these enormous applications that have gone in. And genuinely, I do believe we need a sound plan to actually highlight where is the best place for those parks, and you know, genuinely to look at our grade 1, 2 and 3A land and, you know, ask questions about, is that the best place? So I think all of these things are critical. Green space, and all of that. DEFRA is committed to, through its food strategy, to our maintaining the broad current levels of food production. I agree with Minette, it would be great to actually up that a bit, but I certainly agree that there are certain things we actually need to focus on, which we are doing in the strategy, in particular horticultural strategy. And I do think the point she made about water. So one of my areas I was working on specifically before I was kind of forced to step down was a holistic plan for water. So water is not just critical in terms of the pressure we're putting on other countries and we're buying in their products. And I think we do need to look at our global footprint. We do need to factor that in to the costs of food and the pressures we're putting on overseas. And we do need to invest here in tech innovation, which we are doing through many of our funds, so that we can have climate resilient crops. We can have crops that need to use less water. And water is absolutely critical in my view, in terms of its future. We are going to have a water shortage if we're not careful. We've got some plans in place, but that's where land use mapping will be so vital, because we need to work on a catchment scale basis. We need to work together with our farmers in terms of how they can restore soil to hold water, where they're going to do it, where we're going to put the trees along corridors as river buffers. So all of these things need to go into the mix, and that's why I think this report is important, and the one Sue was referring to as well. B, why it's important that the government has now got this on their radar, and I will certainly be pushing for this with our new leader, because I think it's going to be critical for our new direction of travel. Brownfield was touched on in the report, very good point, lot of work is actually going on across government to develop on more brownfield sites. We've now got a register. Every local authority has got to publish a register of their local brownfield sites. We think there's about 28,000 hectares of developable land on brownfield site. We all know this is all expensive to deliver, but we've also just given permission in principle to speed up housing led development on brownfield registers. And I recently attended a meeting across government with other ministers led by Michael Gove on what other government departments could contribute towards brownfield sites that could be developed on, and indeed land for all these other needs that we need, housing, but also obviously I chipped in for all the other things we want, whether it's food or nature. So I think this is a critical discussion we're having today, and I remain firmly committed to making sure this is on the agenda, and basically it's not a moment too soon.
Thank you, Rebecca. So now we're on to Q&As. I'm going to ask one from me first because I'm the chair, so I can do that. Basically, so a lot of the research that I've looked at has shown that we can't really keep our meat consumption as it currently is, and also be more self-sufficient in food and farm sustainably. All the panelists, would you agree with that? And which policy would you use to stop people from eating less meat? If so, Rebecca, you go first.
Well, you're going to go to Minette on that. We have never come out. I don't think it's government's job to be prescriptive about these things. What I am very pro is sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture with restored ecosystems, which is why I always say you can have nature. We need it. We do need farmers to take up these schemes whereby they are being paid to make sure their soil is healthy, or to put in insect, strips, so they've got more pollinators, buffer zones, with trees. That helps water conservation and all of that. Get all those things right and have a mixed agriculture. And I think we're on the right track, and put your nature in much poorer areas of land where we can plant our trees and do our peatland restoration. And I think the public are bright, they'll make their own choices about what they're eating. And already we're seeing a shift, and farmers, they're not stupid either. They recognise shifts. Loads of them are already doing really creative, innovative, new products and all the rest of it. My own family farm beef animals, but they also farm arable crops, got loads of nature and wildlife, and it's wonderful ranging beef animals across wonderful mixed grassland. So I think there's a place for it all, and I would say we've got the right policies in place for what we need to restore our land, and that's the critical thing really, and to reduce also our emissions. An awful lot of investment and work's going on with farmers in particular to reduce their emissions, reduce their slurry emissions, work on feeding stocks for livestock that mean the livestock give off less emissions. So I think tech, innovation and all of that direction is also critically important to get to where we need to go in sustainability.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Minette?
Gosh, this question comes up so much. Look, the elephant crashing around the room at the moment is the production of milling wheat. And I think so much of these conversations are binary in that actually we've got to stop growing grains that we feed to our livestock. So producing milling wheat is not a given for a start. You've got to be on really good land, and you've got to massively invest in getting the quality that you need and having the climate conditions to produce milling wheat. So that's first point. And the second point I make is you can have unsustainable meat and unsustainable plant. And I do think our diet focus should be far more on highly processed foods rather than the binary meat versus plant. But the second, sorry, I made the second point. The other bit to this is if you haven't made the grade on milling wheat, which many parts of the country will not, then it has to have an alternative spec market, which is either the bioethanol market, which is very, very good for the green economy, that we have greener fuels, and also out of spec going into feed wheat for the pig and poultry sector, because it will go nowhere else. We can't eat it ourselves. We can only eat it through producing a protein. So that's the point I'd make, Helena, and we cannot link production with consumption. Our diets might change here. Hopefully we might start eating less highly processed food and get more to cooking from scratch and eating natural whole foods, which would be much, much better. but we should be exporting a high quality product that maybe we're not consuming here, rather than denying other parts of the world that do not have the temperate conditions that we have. So it's about, as Rebecca said, sustainability, but let's get caught into this trap of we shouldn't be feeding our wheat to our livestock. In many cases, there is no choice. And if we don't focus on the production of milling wheat, we are literally sleepwalking many parts of the world into starvation, because it'll be about bread, as it was with the Arab Spring, but this will make the Arab Spring look mild.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question, I think, because we are pushed for time, and we also have someone from DEFRA here, so I'm going to ask his question. Daniel Lewis from DEFRA asks, as I understand it, the current government isn't interested in the active promotion of dietary change as a way of addressing climate change and food security. Where do we stand on this question? I guess it's kind of similar to my question, but do we think the government is focusing on dietary change? I'll go to Tom.
Did you say Sue? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, did you say me, Helena? Yeah. Dietary change, I mean, certainly, well, I can't really answer for the government. And just going back to the previous question and rolling it in, I mean, CPRE aren't really about telling people what they should and shouldn't eat. Having said that, we do recognise that the climate emergency is the biggest threat to the countryside. So we need to look at a low carbon diet, what that looks like nutritionally, what that looks like from a land use perspective is complicated. But we do see a role for livestock. I don't think it is binary, like Minette said. We see a role for livestock, we see a role for meat, but it needs to be less, probably, and same with dairy. And we're kind of following the evidence of some of the reports that have come out recently on this. So I think we're saying everything in balance. We need to, the land use decisions we need to make around production are obviously complicated, and there's some very eminent people here that are talking about it. But overall, if we're going to be serious about addressing the climate emergency, we are going to need to make changes to everything we do, including our diets.
Thank you. What about you, Sue? What do you think?
I very much agree with much of what colleagues have said already, but so I'm going to contribute the perspective that we hear from our work with citizens all around the country. We've done two, I think, very revealing pieces of work around food and food systems with 150 of the poorest communities in England in partnership with local trusts, the big local communities. And the sorts of things that we hear from those communities might surprise people listening and folk on the panel. When governments say, we're not here to tell people what to eat, citizens themselves are very curious about that, because in fact, citizens do want clear guidance on what is healthy and what is sustainable. That's why there's a big momentum growing behind the clear labelling initiative. But they're also really pretty grumpy that governments aren't more interventionist to constrain the production of, frankly, unhealthy food. I mean, Nestlé itself reported to its board last year that 60% of its product lines are categorically unhealthy. And yet they're making eye-watering profits from foods that are bad for people and indeed bad for planet. So I think we all have to take a bit more responsibility in getting into those sorts of conversations which recognise that the choices we make have huge implications. And as I say, citizens kind of expect their governments and indeed the companies that supply them to look after their health and well-being, or to at least consider their health and well-being. And that's a point of view that's very rarely expressed.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to ask 3 questions in a row because we're pressed for time and I've been asked to do that. So take notes, everyone. So my first question is from James Woodward from Sustain Alliance. He says about 600,000 homes are empty in the UK. What can the UK government do to make sure these are livable, available and affordable as a priority over building new homes as part of relieving pressure on land uptake? Dustin Benton from Green Alliance asks, what can we do to produce more healthy food like fruit and veg in favour of unhealthy food like sugar beet, especially as the latter now requires irrigation? And Jake Fyans, the Director of Conservation at Holcombe Estate, says, do you think farmers can meet the challenge of feeding people and making space for nature in combination? And Minette, you go first. And unfortunately, Rebecca Powner has to go to PMQs.
unmute myself. So Dustin's point on, I mean, look, it's about establishing the right policies, Dustin, as you know better than anybody. And I mean, for growers at the moment, I mean, the pressures are just extraordinarily high. We are losing growers hand over fist. Many of them have global businesses. They have businesses in Senegal, in Spain, and they are moving out. And there's a massive issue around labour. Now, automation will get there. It will get there, but it won't get there tomorrow. It won't get there next year at scale. So we can pick strawberries, raspberries, all of those things. The robot can do it, but it can't do it as fast as the human hand. So firstly, building bridges and the labour. Let's not call it labour, let's call it people. These are brilliant people who come here and pick our fruit and veg, and we've been the preferred country to do it. So we need to sort that out. We need to be able to store our water, Dustin. We need a complete rethink on a water security and not letting diffused water just disappear into the North Sea. So we've got to be able to move it and store it. And then we can produce a lot more of what we want to here. But don't forget, sugar beet has been an important part of a rotation. You've only got to go to Norfolk to see the more rotations you can establish, the better that is for your soil. And yes, where possible, it is being irrigated now, but that is a first. It isn't normally. And actually, if you can produce the most sustainable sugar in the world and you can do it here, why would you stop doing it? So I think it's all about creating market opportunities, but my goodness, do we need to create a market opportunity for the horticultural sector, because there is nothing currently in the SFI for it, no plans until 2024, which is not good enough. Finally, quickly on Jake. Jake, you know my thoughts on this and your brilliant book. You know, we've got to be able to do it all. I don't like this. We're going to have food there and we're going to have environment here. 50% of this country is tenant farmers. So what I say to government is, excuse me, what about the people? Where do they go? And that causes a lot of looking at the fingers and nobody answers. So we've got to do it all. We've got to do more for nature, more for biodiversity, with sustainable food production at the heart of that. Otherwise, we will be covered in solar farms. And we've got to do all of it without any shadow of doubt.
Tom?
Should I just focus on the empty homes one for a minute and housing, just to try and broaden it a little bit, if that's okay? I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is stop obsessing about building new housing, which is a very small percentage of the housing stock. So the obsession with targets that we see, it isn't really, house prices aren't affected by that. It's what happens with existing stock, including some of the empty homes that are referred to in the question. So we need to stop obsessing about that. We need to stop obsessing about homes being an investment instead of a place to live. Those two big things would help. But then at a local level, we need policies that will incentivize local authorities to get those homes back into use for whatever reason they are. And I think, you know, the resource levels at local authorities are very low. They can't do they've lost half their funding over the last 10 years. So we can't really expect issues like empty homes to be addressed without that kind of funding. And I do think it touches into the sort of second homes debate, the Airbnbs. We've done some research on that recently. We are not looking at homes in the right way. We're looking at them as cash cows, investments. And until we start looking at them as homes to live and look at affordable housing and social housing needs in the countryside as much as anywhere else, because that's where there is also that need, we're not going to get anywhere on the housing question.
Great. And Sue, any thoughts on those questions?
On the housing question, absolutely agree. We hear from planners all over the country that they can't even staff their phone lines anymore, let alone engage effectively in what are, you know, really quite substantial power battles with housing corporations, with housing businesses. So we really do need to rebalance where decisions are made, and just referring back to the work that we're doing around our land use framework, in many ways it really tries to get in amongst these really complex, really nuanced questions, but locates them in place. So whilst we can have overarching principles, all of these really complex questions really do have to be negotiated in particular places, taking into account the relative conditions, the relative opportunities, and the relative risks in each of those places. Now, citizens and local anchor institutions understand those better than any, and a process that brings them much more centre stage in mediating these really, really complex questions. You know, how are we going to provide more sustainable, affordable homes in this area, in this place? How are we going to utilise the land in this area for more healthy, sustainable food, particularly perhaps horticulture, nearer to the places that really need healthy fruit and vegetables? All of those are most effectively dealt with and mediated by the key stakeholders with citizens centre stage in place. And that's what we're advocating for in our land use framework.
Great, and now I've got another batch of 3 questions. These are all from people from CPRE, I think. Yep. So the first one is from Helen Marshall, and she says, how can we raise the profile of these issues with the Planning Inspectorate? For example, we have an inspector's report from a local planning appeal where he decided that best and most versatile land only applied to grade 1. Our second question is from Dan Osborne, who's the chair of CPRE Sussex, and he says, how can we develop an overall land use strategy that balances food, climate change, water management, and the needs for housing, business, and infrastructures such as energy? I guess that's kind of like the overarching topic of this discussion. And Brian Kilkelly from CPRE Sussex asks, last week the High Court ruled that the current government strategy for net zero is in breach of the Climate Act. A land use strategy that prioritises brownfields development would surely help to address this breach. I'm going to go to Tom on these because I guess he's from CPRE, so he can.
I'll try and do this really quick, and then we might have time for maybe another round for the rest of the panel. Okay, I mean, I guess the planning inspectorate role, I think that's highlighted in the report as about half the appeals at the moment, planning on appeal, where it involves BMV being put through. So there is a huge problem with the planning inspectorate. We certainly hope reports like today will raise that issue. We regularly meet with DLUC colleagues, hope someone's on the call from DLUC, to try and put that pressure on, because they are decisions that don't make any sense at the local or national level. So I hope we can put pressure there. On the land use strategy, yeah, I mean, I think if you read our House of Lords submission on the land use inquiry, it really is calling for the kind of things we're talking about today. We need the joined-up approach to government. We do need the planning, just on planning, we do need the planning process to actually deliver genuine sustainable development. At the moment, there's this weird presumption in favour of sustainable development, which sounds great, apart from it actually just means build as many houses as we can. That is how it's been translated. So we actually need a genuine definition of that to be operating in the planning system, which would start to address some of these issues. And then the final thing, brownfield, yes, the Climate Act is probably the most powerful piece of legislation that exists in terms of targets and being meaningful. And brownfield, obviously, with its kind of focus on where people are already living, access to services, it is an efficient way of increasing housing stock if it's done at the right densities. And it's got to be a solution, part of the solution to all land use issues, because it does ultimately take the pressure off greenfield, whatever grade that is.
Okay. Great. So Minette, what are your thoughts?
Oh, sorry, I thought you were just going
yeah, I think we can go round and then we'll sum up. So yeah.
Well, Helena, because Tom said that, I wasn't really taking any notice at all. I thought it was very specific to CPRE. I mean, look, I'm in a total agreement with everything that Tom said. I mean, I think we've got a massive emerging issue for planners on solar. It's index linked, you're locked in for 25 to 30 years with so much uncertainty for landowners, land managers out there. We're seeing more and more decide to go down the solar route. Now, that's hugely unpopular with everybody, usually except the one who has the contract for the solar farm. So I think that is a really, really challenging, fast emerging situation that we're not really discussing today. But from our point of view, we want to see much more solar on roofs, and we want to see much more wind turbines within individual farm businesses so they can be much more self-sufficient. And I do think that is flashing red at the moment. It wasn't raised really within those 3 questions, but I think it sort of has a massive touch point with all of them, and probably is the most pressing issue as to why we need to address land use, because otherwise we will be covered in solar.
Great, and then Sue, quickly from you, then we can go on to summing up.
I just encourage questioners perhaps have a look on our website. I know my comms director has just popped the link into the chat. So you can have a look at the work that we're already doing in those pilot sites in Cambridgeshire, which has all sorts of land use pressures, which include housing, and in Devon, where where flood risk is high on people's minds. So we're starting to demonstrate some really strong evidence about how land use frameworks can help mediate these really complex decisions.
Great. So we've had some really interesting, a lot of problems, but we have had some interesting solutions as well to these problems. And hopefully the government's going to take notice and actually give us something. I think it's next year the land use framework's coming out, something ambitious on it. And I really, really hope they do. And it's not like other strategies that we see that kind of all aspiration and not very much help. And I think that farmers actually been asked to come up with a lot of the solutions themselves. So hopefully there'll be a bit more help. So let's all go and sum up. So Minette, do you want to go first?
Helena, thanks. Went on to mute. I think this conversation and the questions asked, I noticed there was a question to me in the chat about supermarkets. I mean, my goodness, the market we're operating in is becoming more and more cutthroat. You're now seeing Amazon enter into it. That'll be driving prices down even further. We're seeing some of the best producers out there get agreement on price at the moment and then be delisted for the autumn. So be under no illusions that the decisions you make in the shop, the decisions that each and every one of us make in store and how we challenge the retailers is pretty critical to what the future of our countryside looks like. So I feel there's a time to reset. We've lost, I think, a lot of time to date with the current government and lack of strategy, lack of policy, quite honestly, on food production and what it's going to look like. So when the autumn comes, the need for us to work together and get this right and drive what I would call a new economic model for our countryside is absolutely essential. We have got to drive that investment back into the land. And that means, I'm afraid, that how we are trading our food simply isn't fit for purpose. And we have to establish something that does achieve fair returns back to the farm gate where they are receiving ever less out of it. Thanks, Helena.
Thank you, Sue.
I'm just going to reiterate my great support for the report that CPRE has produced today, contributing this really important and very, very timely new set of evidence alongside the wealth of other research and data that we need to take into account when we start making these really critical and sometimes irreversible decisions about how we use our land. They're really, really complex, and we're doing this at a time when the government that we have in power is not demonstrating its ability to think in a really connected and joined up way across its different departments. So my suggestion is that we all focus our attention on Treasury at the moment, who probably have the strongest role to play in ensuring that these critical and interconnected, interdependent decisions give real public value and public benefit to all citizens.
Great, thank you. And finally, Tom.
I get the last word. Thank you, Helena. Yeah, listen, it's been a great debate and I wish we had more time. We've only just touched some of the issues. I think what I reflect on a bit is data. Data's been really important today, and CPRE's job is to do that well, but others do that too. And the government really need to get a hand on data. Without data, we're not going to get a land use strategy that makes any sense. The other area that we haven't had much time to talk about is localism. Sue touched on some of the local experiences and pilots that are being done. And I thought we might talk a bit more about that today, but there is really a need, national level policies can only go so far. A lot of this needs to be done on the ground, and support for farmers in particular around advice and better land management, etc., which is another area just I thought we'd talk about a bit more. But sort of sum up, the key thing I think is this whole economic model for rural and the failure of the market. Now, if you look at solar, we've not got time to get into that, but that is an example of the market failing. Housing, the housing crisis, particularly in rural areas, is the market failing. So we need to get a system in place that actually puts public benefit first. Now that's a bit old-fashioned, but the market is not delivering for our rural communities, whether it's solar farms or lack of affordable housing or Airbnbs. So we do need to look at that, and we do need to acknowledge, probably in the land use area, that there are trade-offs. There are conflicts, Sue has particularly mentioned, and there are no easy answers. So I don't want to hide behind some of these questions for land use and landscapes. Things are going to have to change if we're going to meet the challenge of the climate emergency. But I think, you know, today we've heard a lot of solutions. CPRE have got more solutions on these kind of issues, and it's a great debate, and I wish we had more time. So thank you, Helena, for some great sharing.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we've just about finished on time, and yeah, I wish we could talk about it more. I'm sure we could all talk about this all day, and I hope to speak to you all about it more in the future. I think it's going to become even more a pressing issue as things, you know, as the years go by. So thank you, everyone, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, Helena. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.